A number of countries who have reacted to the speed and scale of AI and the change that AI has unleashed on the world with discomfort, just burying their heads in their sand, hoping everything will figure itself out. And that's not how the world works. AI is not just compute infrastructure. Our AI strategy is also our defense strategy. It's also our economic strategy. It's also our cultural strategy.
Anjney Midha, founder of AMP PBC, is a leading AI investor and former general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, known for backing companies like Anthropic and 11 Labs. He's been at the forefront of shaping the next wave of artificial intelligence.
When you look at LLMs, do you still see an opportunity there?
Public's participation in wealth creation around AI, I don't think has been thought through in a deeply enough fashion. I believe that long term, humanity is resilient and we do figure out how to unlock productivity of new technologies.
Everyone says, we just need so much compute, like none of this is even enough.
I have a hard time seeing us where we're not compute constrained and energy constrained for the foreseeable future.
Hi everyone, my name is Yasmin Alkhowaiter and welcome back to the End of Limits, the AI podcast by HUMAIN. My guest today is Anjney Midha, a venture partner at Andreessen Horowitz. Thank you so much for being here today, Anj.
Thanks for having me.
So in addition to being a venture partner, you were also formerly a vice president at Discord, where you oversaw the launch of the partnership with Midjourney. And you're also an angel investor, and your investments include Anthropic, Luma AI, who are our partners, as well as several other AI companies. So you've been an early adopter and enthusiast about AI, and super excited to have you here with us today to talk about the global context of AI, what policy and regulation should look like, what business models you're looking at right now as an investor, and then finally, how you see product development in the age of AI as someone with a background in product. And to get us rolling, you're in Saudi Arabia today for FII, amongst other things. And the relationship between US and Saudi, and specifically the Valley and Saudi, has, been hitting all-time highs. I think it's a super warm relationship. Wanted to ask, aside from the deep pockets here, what brings you here? What potential do you see? Why do you think that partnership is going so strong?
It starts with the people, right? I just think there's a lot of shared values between the two countries. There's a belief that frontier technologies like AI are the future. I think there's an understanding that economic growth is critical to progress, is critical to the prosperity and success of future generations, and that the best chance at unlocking economic growth comes from embracing the most promising breakthroughs in technology that can unlock growth and progress, and that AI represents one of those. And so I've just been, over the years, I think there have been several moments where I've realized that unlike some other countries, what the US and the kingdom share is this belief that technological growth and technological progress is critical for future generations, and that we've got to invest now in the infrastructure that will unlock that growth. And I think that's rare, because often there are other countries, change is hard for humans to embrace. And I think there are a number of countries who have reacted to the speed and scale of AI and the change that AI has unleashed on the world with discomfort, with a sense of trepidation, and sometimes just burying their heads in their sand, hoping everything will figure itself out. And that's not how the world works. And I think in contrast, in the US, certainly there's an embrace of the technology. There's in ways that accelerates its adoption, accelerates its positive impacts. And I think I've noticed that seems to be a shared belief here as well. And I think in particular, there's a degree of sort of understanding of how important infrastructure is.
Right.
Because infrastructure can be this very difficult part of the economy to reason about, because it often requires extraordinary capital expenditure upfront, and the people who often reap the rewards of that are future generations. And so it requires a level of long-term thinking that's quite rare. You have to often defer attention, time, resources away from a number of other short-term projects under the belief that all this capex, all this infrastructure build out you do today will benefit future generations. And I think while that's definitely, in Silicon Valley at least, that has been a baseline, I think, assumption for many years, because it's such a technology focused place, and the idea that you invest now for future progress is sort of canon there. I think the kingdom has embraced that as part of its 2030 vision in a way that many other countries around the world are yet to embrace.
It helps also when you have a crown prince who can, comfortably envision a 50-year timeline instead of a 4-year term.
I think that's what's rare, is leadership that can orient large groups of people towards a long-term goal.
Yeah.
And I think that's really hard to do, whether you're doing it, at startup scale, at enterprise scale, at nation scale. Leadership is in short supply.
Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about AI infrastructure specifically, so if we break it down roughly into, the data center layer, the large language model layer, and then the app layer, the data center layer to me increasingly feels like more of a national security play than a private play in some aspects. So how do you grapple with, working with different countries, but at the same time keeping AI regional for, security purposes?
So I think, a few months ago, a lot of nation state leaders started realizing, probably around the time DeepSeek came out, that AI is not just compute infrastructure. It's national infrastructure, because AI is a general purpose technology, and you end up using it in ways like defense, national security, healthcare that affect the future of your country. And what's also unique about AI is that it's cultural infrastructure, because it's trained on data that often represents the values of the people that data is about.
Right.
And so I think that what's changed in the last 6, 7, 8 months is that the conversation has gone from it being from AI adoption being this primarily a conversation about the technology to being a conversation about culture and national capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly a number of countries are realizing, well, our AI strategy is also our defense strategy. It's also our economic strategy. It's also our cultural strategy. If all your citizens are talking to an AI assistant like ChatGPT every day, it really matters what values that assistant reflects and guides and nudges your population towards. That has resulted, I think, in the rise and demand for sovereign AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the idea that you control and you can align the values that the AI models, the AI systems, the agents reflect, what they can and can't say, what they prioritize. And it's a difficult thing to reason about, because most of the world does not have frontier models. And so when I talk to a lot of nation state leaders, they often ask, well, we don't have frontier models in our country. So what do we do? Are we doomed to using another country's values? And I think the answer lies in the past. If you look at moments in time where we've had new general purpose technologies, the internet is one example. The rise of actually oil is a great sort of technological revolution to look at, where what happened is the U.S. was was at the forefront of that technology wave. In the case of oil, it was drilling, refining, exploration. And what the United States did was say, well, we've got a number of allied partners around the world, and what we can do is embrace them all and share our technology with them and create an ecosystem for them locally that benefits us and them. Because if we don't do that, they're going to feel left out of the future. And we'd rather have our allies share in the future that we're creating than feel like they have to look to adversarial countries for that. And I think that's where we are with AI. Saudi Aramco is a great example of a joint venture between two countries that has resulted in extraordinary prosperity for both the United States and the kingdom. And I think that's the model for AI as well. So as an example of how that's happening, Mistral is a company out of France that trains frontier open source models, and they train base models on a sort of global set of data mixes and values. And then what they offer governments around the world is a chance to take those base models and do custom post training to customize the last mile on that country's local values, knowledge, and need. And often that's set up with a joint venture with the government, where the value that's being created, the infrastructure is all local. And then over time, essentially the country is able to take over the entire AI pipeline that results in the creation of that agent or assistant. And so what I see over the next few years is you will have shared base models come from wherever the best talent is. And today that is in Silicon Valley, it's in China, it's in Europe. But those teams will be exporting those base models and then allow those models to be customized for the local context. That's led to the rise of this entirely new discipline in machine learning called post-training, right? Pre-training is the idea of you do a massive training run where you download the entire internet and all of humanity's knowledge into a model. And then post-training is the idea that you then customize the last mile of that model on whatever set of local beliefs, customs, traditions, values, and in some cases, even like verified rewards to make that model perform in a reliable way on a specific task you care about.
As an investor then, when you look at LLMs, do you still see an opportunity there? Because to me, the arrival of DeepSeek kind of showed that you can be a latecomer to the game and you can catch up just as quickly. And so what I would be more bullish on is the app layer and not necessarily the LLM layer, particularly because you also have governments looking to fill that gap.
I think the first 3-4 years of frontier AI were dominated by this idea of a frontier model lab, right? Where pre-training models was the primary task, the primary challenge. I think we're now moving into an era of frontier agents. Right? And frontier agent labs are similar to frontier model labs, but they're also different in an important regard, which is they often don't have to do their own pre-training. They can rely on an ecosystem of pre-trained models. Those could be open source, those could be closed source from partners. But then they actually build the end-to-end system on top of the pre-trained model. And the system can often take the form of multiple models, multiple tools that are then post-trained into one workflow. And what you get is an agent that is super sort of focused on a specific industry, is very capable, is able to do a ton of really difficult tasks that we've never had software able to do. But a frontier agent lab is a slightly different sort of research and deployment organization than a frontier model lab. And I think where we're entering now is an absolute explosion of frontier agent labs, where you're going to have teams that are fundamentally still, world-class researchers. They need tons of compute. They need their ability to do really, really high quality data engineering is critical. And so these are quite involved machine learning organizations, but their focus is on building the agent end to end that can actually sometimes sit on customers' infrastructure and be deployed in on-prem, versus being a lab that just puts out a base model. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So we are moving sort of towards the era of more specialized agent software as opposed to a general large language model.
That's right. I think that LLMs are a component of agents, but when you look at the stack, right, as you were saying earlier, you've got chips, you've got infrastructure, you've got models, and now you've got agents. And I think what you'll see is vertical specific frontier labs that take one entire industry and build that entire training pipeline just for that industry.
Interesting. Okay, but before we get into the business model of it, I want to circle back to when we're talking about more of the global order and structuring, and talk a little bit about what you think the future of regulation looks like, because we fumbled with social media, I would say, to put it lightly, and now I see sort of a similar path being taken by OpenAI, where they're going heavy on the move fast and break things, and then retroactively adjusting to when people complain. What do you think are the lessons we should learn and apply in this era?
So I think we have to work backwards from the outcomes that I think we want. And a big outcome that I think we aren't reasoning about as just as a community in tech is that the public's participation in wealth creation around AI is just not. I don't think has been reasoned about and thought through in a deeply enough fashion. And I think the speed and scale at which AI is changing and unleashing automation on many, many types of industries where many leaders thought that automation would come very late. A great example is knowledge work. For a long time, the traditional framework for economies, emerging markets, has been you sort of start off as an agrarian society, and then you move up the value chain to manufacturing, and then you move up that to services. And the idea was that services was always sort of the highest form of an educated society's expression of skills, right? And so if you look at many developed countries today, large portions of their GDP are dominated by services. And it turns out that's actually the first domino to fall, because agents are really good, especially with, I think, some of the newer techniques like reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards, at doing knowledge work. And that's going to result, while I believe that long term, humanity is resilient and we do figure out how to unlock productivity of new technologies we have throughout history, the short-term transition pains can be quite painful. And I don't think regulators and policymakers around the world have really started to reason urgently enough about how to ease the short-term transition pains. One example of that is in the United States, there's still a state-by-state sort of approach to AI regulation versus a unified federal framework. Now, I think the current Trump administration put out a unified framework called the AI Action Plan a few months ago,
right,
which is totally a step in the right direction relative to the Biden administration's.
Yeah, China put out one at the same time, so it was interesting to see the parallels in those.
And I think that's encouraging.
Yeah.
Right, because that means there's at least for countries that have vast amounts of compute like the United States and China, they're at least trying to ensure that AI progress follows a sort of unified framework. I think the signal we're getting from policymakers is an acknowledgement that if we can accelerate AI in the right way, the positive benefits are extraordinary.
Right.
Discovering new materials, solving a bunch of unsolved medical problems, new drug discovery. I mean, these are all the benefits we've been promised for a long time. And finally, we have the recipe to actually unlock it. And I think policymakers don't want to get in the way of that. So that's good. I think the bad news or what I'm waiting to see on regulation is an execution of the AI Action Plan. It at least part of the battle is getting the plan right, but then most of the remaining battle is actually executing on that plan. And that there are just a number of regulations up and down the stack that need to be fixed, accelerated across the world to unlock AI progress. Energy is a great example. In the United States, I just think we're staring down an extraordinary shortage of energy, and we're going to have to figure out a way to unlock permitting, cabling, construction at a scale that we just haven't unlocked yet. I think
at least the US is finally moving on nuclear, which has been held up for a while.
Yeah, it's about time. I think nuclear is one of the only paths the United States has at unlocking the energy footprint needed for all the base load increases as a result of the data center capacity demand. Other parts of the world aren't. Germany is not actually embracing nuclear as it should be. In fact, it looks like it might be headed in the opposite direction. France is an encouraging signal because they did invest in a number of nuclear projects, in the 80s and 90s, and now are going through the process of upgrading those for AI workloads. So globally, I think there's a bit of a patchwork, and I think one of the reasons the Middle East is so encouraging is because energy infrastructure here is, one, able to leapfrog a lot of legacy infrastructure because a lot of it is new.
Right.
But then two, I think amongst policymakers here, there is an understanding that energy independence, energy transitions, and energy resilience is fundamental to the nation's future. And I think a lot of other regions around the world have to catch up.
The energy conversation, of course, brings us to the compute scarcity, because every single founder I have on here, I ask them, what keeps you up at night? And it's without fail the same answers. How do I get more compute? Do you think energy is the primary unlock there? What do you think needs to happen to get to that level of compute?
So not all compute is born the same, as you know. And I think that it is encouraging that we're unlocking this idea of compute embassies around the world, where if you can have bilateral agreements between countries that trust each other, then you can have a region that has a strength in one part of the AI stack, like talent or foundation models, be able to have a sort of comparative trade relationship with regions that have an advantage in energy abundance, right? So you can have training and inference workloads in one region run by teams in another region. And I think that's a win-win situation. To unlock that, I don't think that's a technical problem anymore. I think we have the infrastructure we need for a team in Silicon Valley to be training frontier models in the kingdom here.
Okay.
What we need is trust infrastructure, right? Where if there's an enterprise or company or a nation that wants to run their workloads in another country, that workload is treated with the same sort of geographical policy that an embassy would, right? Embassies around the world literally adhere to the laws of the home nation, right? And I think that's what we're going to have see in infrastructure globally.
Data embassies.
Yeah,
makes sense. Is there that's in terms of obviously like a sovereignty and security perspective. From a business perspective, we see ever crazier numbers announced by NVIDIA, OpenAI in terms of investments into data centers. And everyone says, we just need so much compute, like none of this is even enough. Is there a danger that actually it might have been enough a little while ago and we're, building out too much, that some of it is going to be redundant?
I have a hard time seeing us be in any regime where we're not compute constrained and energy constrained for the foreseeable future.
Okay.
You take an example of a new use case like real-time video generation. You guys are partners with Luma.
Right.
Luma's working on a number of frontier video models.
Yeah, Amit was one of the people who said, I need more compute.
Yeah, I just don't think we are prepared. The world is prepared for the compute needs of real-time video generation, because if you think about it, once you have a really good, robust real-time video model, the applications of that are in everything from robotics to all of software, because you don't even need to render software traditionally anymore.
Right.
All graphics gets now rendered out as a video model. All simulations of the physical world in real estate, in architecture, in robotics and entertainment media. And I'd like to believe that at some point we'll have such massive algorithmic breakthroughs that we get a ton more workloads from the same compute footprints. But until then, we're stuck with the current sort of omnimodal transformer architectures, and I just don't think there's enough compute to go around for that. And that's just one new use case. Then we haven't even talked about reinforcement learning on in mission critical systems, right? One of the limitations of AI for many years, or when I say many, I mean from 2020 to 2022, was that the frontier models were really good at tasks like companionship and chatting with consumers, but they just weren't reliable enough or precise enough on mission critical tasks. And what's changed with reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards is we now have a recipe to make them extraordinarily precise at problems where if you can define the reward model correctly, the models just get really good at being dependable. And that has opened up finally the markets for mission critical areas like defense and healthcare and finance. And that unlocks a bunch of compute need that we're not ready for yet. So I just have a hard time seeing us in a world of compute, getting out of our compute constrained regime for a long, long time.
I see. Then to pivot and talk about all these companies that need that compute, what are you looking for right now as an investor? Because so many, I'm sure startups knock at your door every single day and say, we're an AI-enabled X software company.
Right.
What are the true markers of success that you're looking for? And are they the same markers that you were looking for in past years? Are there different signals of success now?
I think the signals haven't changed very, very much in that it starts with the team.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that, especially if you're building a frontier AI system like an agent, you just need to be really, really good at machine learning, at post-training techniques. You don't need to be. I think there's enough of an open source ecosystem today that you can start with open source pre-trained models to initialize your pipeline, but you just need to be really, really good at post-training. Now, that doesn't mean you need a team of PhDs who've, all worked at OpenAI or something like that. In fact, some of the most creative researchers I've worked with haven't even had traditional research backgrounds. We're still so early in the post-training era where if you're just a good systems thinker and you can reason about, what the agent needs to do, a lot of the techniques to do post-training on top of trained pre-trained models are quite accessible to teams. I just think you need to be, you do need to be a team that understands how to use those techniques. And I think increasingly more importantly, you need to understand the industry you're in, because the success of that agent is a function of how deeply it's integrated into the customer's problem. The reward model has to be so good and so specific that if you want the agents to actually perform, you need to be able to train them to succeed on the tasks that actually correlate to business success. And I think that's a rare skill set. It comes from having a level of empathy and understanding of the end customer that is not common. And so those are two things I look for: is the ability to be a world-class machine learning organization, but also be an expert in the customer's problems that you want to solve.
I see. On the topic of having a solid team, and what I think you talked a little bit about the depth of knowledge that they need to have and the hunger that they need to have. There's a tweet of yours from a few days ago about what team structure should look like.
Should ignore my Twitter entirely.
just to ask, what you meant by this one. Few things did more damage to tech than mid-level managers misusing the Spotify org squad design blog post. So
yes.
what advice would you have to people who want to structure their teams who might have otherwise modeled themselves after the Spotify org squad? I should caveat again, you should ignore my Twitter. That one in particular was inspired by when I was a founder. I started and sold a company a few years ago. And when you're a founder, you're looking for ways to scale your team in a way that makes sense. And we had gone from, I built a 3D mapping business called Ubiquity 6. We were using computer vision and deep learning to do large-scale 3D reconstruction. And we were growing really fast. We went from 16 people to 75 people in 12 months. And as a CEO and founder, I was just, when you grow that fast, you just need to come up with the right systems and processes to make your team perform like a tier one athletic team. And so I started looking around I started talking to other founders and CEOs on tools that they'd use to scale their teams. And one tool I kept getting pointed to was this Spotify blog post about like how you should structure product teams to build delightful products, or how they did it. And I think it was great for Spotify to put that out because they were sharing their learnings with the community. I think the way it got interpreted by a lot of startups and Silicon Valley was, oh, that worked for them, let's just do it here too.
And rarely does just copy pasting somebody else's organizational theory work for you. What I believe now, having worked with a number of research teams, is that, especially a bunch of frontier AI teams, is that each one of them is completely different. And that's exactly how it should be. Well, sure, there's some underlying principles that are shared. Things like you should have a culture that has a directly responsible individual, where there's one person who really can drive a project completion, to completion end to end. But the actual org chart, the actual way you structure your teams, should be a reflection of what you as a founder and your team is great at, and what you need to solve for. So a great example of an organization that's quite that has almost no, doesn't look at all like the Spotify org is NVIDIA, right? Jensen is famous for having this org chart where he has like 50 or 60 direct reports, which is sort of anathema, is antithetical to the Silicon Valley best practice era of the 2010s, of the Spotify era. That actually what you should have is these pods, and the pods should report to a manager, and the manager should report to a functional leader, and the functional leader can report to the CEO, and that's how you decentralize everything. And that's not how NVIDIA works. Jensen has 50 to 60 direct reports, and he's famous for providing feedback to all of them publicly, and there's no idea of one-on-ones where then information has to get transmitted out. And look, that structure works for him. It's designed to be a sports car that he can drive to the max speed and accelerate his impact on the world. And I think every startup and every organization should be custom designed for the founders of that startup and their team to maximize their impact on the world. And if the answer is an org structure that makes no sense to everybody else, that's fine. In fact, that's probably a mark of good first principles thinking. AI labs, like Anthropic, is structured very differently from OpenAI, which is structured very differently from Mistral, which is structured very differently from Luma. And they're all doing incredible things at the frontier. They're all, growing at several hundreds of percentages in revenue growth a year. And it's evidence that there's no one right answer on how you should structure your team. And so, the Spotify tweet was a bit tongue in cheek, but there was a level of frustration from a few years ago. And I'm happy to report that a lot of teams today are next generation founders who haven't even heard of the Spotify blog post. So that's good.
That's amazing. They're moving forward. They're starting a new era. On that note of sort of specialization and doing what works for you, I think we talked a little bit previously about how you should have last mile localized for countries at the model layer.
Right.
I'm curious if you think, because obviously in the past decade or so of Middle East venture capital, it's been a lot of models that copy essentially what happened in the US, right? So you have the classic Uber and Careem example. Do you think we're going to see that with agents as well? Or shall we not do that again, sort of create localized models that can't grow globally and instead try to innovate from the get-go?
So I think that what's interesting about AI, right, is that because the models are trained on data, unlike Uber, where really the same software that worked great in San Francisco also worked in Bangalore and worked well in Shanghai. And actually what ended up happening is the reason you have a regional player like Didi in China and Uber in the United States is not technical, it's regulatory, right? In AI, the training data, the values you encode in the post-training don't actually translate that well across cultural contexts. So actually a local team here that understands how to customize models for the local context just structurally has an advantage relative to a team that might be coming from abroad. So a good example of this is if you've ever spoken to ChatGPT, they have a voice, there's a voice mode in ChatGPT. And when one of the languages I speak is Hindi, because I spent part of my childhood in India. And when I speak to it, it speaks like in Hindi, it speaks like an American tourist visiting India. If its accent, its inflections aren't native. And that makes sense because it was post-trained by a team in Silicon Valley.
Right.
In contrast, if you speak to Mistral or you talk to Mistral, Mistral has an application called Le Chat. And if you talk to it in French, it's the diction it uses, the choice of verbiage is dramatically more local than ChatGPT in French. And I think that's where you have local teams creating billions of dollars of value that are play to their strengths. And so I think while the product surfaces might look similar, Le Chat might not look from an interface standpoint that different from ChatGPT, but the underlying systems that power the interface are completely different. And I think you're going to see local teams win in contexts where that last mile needs to feel local.
Makes sense. Would love to talk much longer, but we have very limited time. So one last question to end on. What do you think drives economic value in the age of AI?
People. I think the thing that we're in most short supply of is good leadership. We've already talked about this. I think a small group of people who are technically ambitious have the creativity to embrace new technology and use it in new ways are really what have driven the bulk of technology value in history. And I don't think that's different this time around at all. I think while we've talked a lot about compute constraints and energy constraints, I do believe that the primary bottleneck on AI progress remains talent.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much. This has been a joy. I wish we could have talked for longer, but Riyadh, crazy. And I appreciate your time and your opinions.
Happy to be here.
Thanks. All right.